Hi, and welcome to the Photoshop CC Essential Training 2015. In this course, I'm excited to share with you insights about the most efficient way. If you're a premium member of the lynda.com library, you have access to the exercise files used throughout this course. You can download the files from the Exercise Files tab on the main page for the course. Most of the movies in the course have images that you can use so that you can follow along with the same projects that I'm working on. If you don't have access to the exercise files, you can follow along using your own images. The window view that I use in many of the videos is called full screen, and I enter it to make my images as large as possible. If you want to enter this mode, tap the F key. To exit full screen, use Shift plus the F key. All right, let's get started. Throughout this course, we're going to be opening a number of different images in different file types. When we're in Photoshop, we can always use the File and then Open command in order to use the operating system to open up our images. Here we can navigate to different folders, we can see inside of those folders, and certainly we can select our images and then click Open. However, I feel that it's a little bit slower and not nearly as visual rich of an experience as using Bridge. But most people don't know about Bridge. So I'm going to click Cancel here, return back to the File menu, and then select Browse in Bridge. Now, Bridge is a separate application that you can download and install as part of the Creative Cloud. Bridge does have a separate installer than Photoshop, so you will need to run that installer. If you haven't installed Bridge, please watch the video on installing Bridge in the Introduction section. Here you can see that when I double-click on a folder, I can see multiple images at once. I can click on an image and I see a larger preview in the preview area. If I switch to the folder area, you can see that it's very easy for me to navigate between folders. I can even click on the new folder icon in the upper right to create a new folder, and I can manage my images by dragging and dropping them between folders if I want to. For now, I'll leave this in the same folder. If I need to see additional information about my image, over in the metadata panel, there's a lot of detailed information about the camera settings, as well as the file size and other file properties and metadata. In addition, there's a filter panel and a collections panel, which will help me manage my larger volumes of images. If I want to open a file, I simply double-click on it to open it in Photoshop. If I want to close the file, I'll click on the X to close it. And if I want to return to Bridge, return back to the File menu, and then select Browse in Bridge. If I decide not to open a file from Bridge and want to simply return back to Photoshop, I'll click on the boomerang icon to move to Photoshop. Now, before we wrap up, I'll return to Bridge one more time because I need to tell you that if you're working along with your own exercise files, and those files are raw files, when you double-click on a raw file in order to open it, it will launch Adobe Camera Raw. Here you could make manipulations to the image, and when you want to open it in Photoshop, you would click on Open Image. For more information about Adobe Bridge and Adobe Camera Raw, be sure to check out my Bridge CC Essential Training and Camera Raw Essential Training here on lynda.com. For now, I'll close the image without saving. When you first open Photoshop, one of the first things that I do is maximize it so that it takes up the entire screen. I'll click on the green button here, and now we can see that I'm not distracted by any other applications that are also launched. If I need to switch to another application, Bridge for example, I can use File and then Browse in Bridge. If I want to cycle through all of my open applications, I can use the keyboard shortcut Command-Tab to move through those different applications. The other thing that I make sure to keep on is the application frame. Under the Window menu, if I choose to because Photoshop is so many things to so many different customers, it has a tremendous number of options. When you're just starting out, this can seem overwhelming. For example, look at the number of panels that show by default. Now, your panels might look different, so if they do, from the Workspace picker, be sure to select Essentials. If you select that and they still look different, then select the Workspace picker again and choose Reset Essentials. Now we're all starting at the same place. Of course, these aren't all of the panels that Photoshop has to offer. If we go under the Window menu, you can see that there are several more that aren't even being displayed. The panels that are on top, for example, the Color panel, has a check mark next to it, and we can see that in fact it is the top panel nested with the swatches. If I click on the Swatches panel to bring it to the top, and I go to the Window menu, you can see that the Color panel no longer has the check, but the Swatches panel does. If I select a panel that isn't already showing, for example, the Info panel, Photoshop will add it to this second column of panels. Some panels automatically nest with others, just like the Info panel automatically nested with the Properties panel. Now, panels can be in a variety of different states. They can be in this icon state that we see here, or they can be in their expanded view. In order to collapse the Properties and the Info panel back to their icon view, we can click on the two triangles. If you click on the double arrows at the top of a row of panels, then that entire row of panels expands. We can click it again in order to collapse them. If I position my cursor right on the border of the iconic panels and click and drag, I can actually expand them to another state. This state is called the icon with the label. In the icon with a label view, you have a grabber handle right here where you can click and drag in order to reorder those panels. If I want to float a panel, I can click on the name of the panel and then simply drag it out into the preview area here. If I want to expand it, I can click on the double arrows, and if I want to close it, I can click on the check mark. If there are panels that we don't use, say the Swatches panel, for instance, and I only want to close the Swatches panel but not the Color panel, I can right mouse click or control click on the name of the panel, and then I can close just that panel. If I wanted to close an entire group, I could right mouse click and then choose Close Tab Group. If I need to rearrange a panel within a grouping here, I can click on the panel's name and then just drag it in order to rearrange it. I can also move a panel to be nested or grouped with another panel by clicking on the name of the panel and then dragging it on top of the other panel that I want it to nest with. You'll see a cyan outline around the entire panel, and when I let go of the cursor, we can see that those two are nested. I can also create a new grouping of panels, again by selecting the Panel tab by clicking on the name of the panel and then dragging it between other panels. Here you'll notice that I only get the single cyan line, and when I release my cursor, it becomes in a group all of its own. I can then add additional panels to that group by selecting the name and then dragging and dropping them in to nest. If I want to add additional columns of panels, I can select a panel and then drag it in between. Now we see the cyan line going up and down vertically, and when I release the cursor, it adds that as an entirely new column. If I want to drag another panel and add it to that, I can click and drag, and when I position it at the very top or at the very bottom, I'll get that cyan line where I can release the cursor and nest the info and the paths together in the same column. If I want to minimize any of the panels, I can double click on the tab for the panel in order to minimize it, and if I want to reveal its contents again, I simply single click on it. You can even move your tools if you want to dock with your panels. You'll see there's a grabber icon at the top of the tools. I'll select that, drag it over, and when I see that cyan line, I can drop it. If I want to temporarily hide all of the panels at one time, I can tap the Tab key. Now, they're just hidden, and if I position my cursor over to the right-hand side of the screen, you'll notice that they'll pop out so that I can see them, and I could do something like select a layer or a color, and when I position my cursor outside of that grouping of panels, they will automatically hide again. If I tap the Tab key, I can bring back those panels. Let's go ahead and reposition my tools back on the left-hand side. If I tap the Tab key again, you'll notice that not only do the panels hide, but also the tools. I'll tap Tab to bring them back, And this time I'll add the Shift key and tap the Tab key. That only hides the panels, but the tools remain visible. I'll use the Shift key again with Tab to bring back those panels. I can also show my tools in two columns if I want to by clicking on the double arrows. If I want to bring them back to the single column, I'll click the double arrows again. Most panels also have flyout menus. For example, if I click on this icon on the Layers panel, you can see that I have a number of different options. If I wanted to change my panel options, for example, I could select that, and then I could change the thumbnail size, making it larger, or change thumbnail contents or any of the other options. For now, I will go ahead and set that back to what it was, and then click OK. Now, in order to reset our panels, we'll select from the workspace to Reset Essentials. And now we're back to where we started. So as you can see, it's very easy to customize the panels that you use most often in Photoshop. As you become more experienced in Photoshop, you'll find that you'll use different groups of panels for performing different tasks, and it will be helpful to customize the panel locations and save them. Now, by default, we're in the Essential workspace, but of course, we can rearrange and hide and show any panels at any time. And you can see that Photoshop ships with a number of different workspaces. So for example, if you were doing some painting, you might want to switch to that workspace so that you have access to your swatches and the brush panel. If you're working on an image that has a lot of type in it, you might want to switch to the Typography workspace so that you have access to your character and paragraph panel, the styles, as well as the glyphs panel. For now, let's return back to the Essential workspace, and I'm going to show you the workspace that I actually prefer working in when I do most of my compositing. Now, instead of having the panels on the right-hand side, I actually work with the panels on the left-hand side. And the reason that I do that is because I find that over the course of the day, I'm constantly going to the different menu items across the top, and I'm selecting different tools. And then to go all the way across my monitor in order to just select a different layer takes a lot of time. So I'm going to select my Layers panel, and I'm going to drag it over to nest it next to my tools. I also use the Properties panel a lot and the History panel. So first, I'll select the History panel, I'll click the icon, and then click on the History tab and nest that with my Layers panel. The Properties panel I actually want underneath my Layers panel, so I'll select the tab, drag it to the bottom of the Layers panel, and when I release my cursor with that solid cyan line down there, it will add it in its own grouping. I also use paths a lot, so I'll select the Path panel and drag that to the top to put it in its own grouping. I might add the channels to that as well. And remember, if they're in the wrong order, I can always click and drag to reorder my panels within a nested group. And then if I want to close the other panels, I can right mouse click or control click on Mac and close the tab group. I'll do the same thing here, closing the tab group. And finally, one more time, I'm just going to right mouse click and close the tab group there. So this is the way that I prefer to work in Photoshop, but of course you can set up your panels and your tools any way that you want to. When you're finished, you'll want to save that as a workspace. So from the Workspace Picker, I'll choose New Workspace, give it a name, and you'll notice that I can also capture keyboard shortcuts and menus, but we haven't set those up yet, so I'll just click Save in order to save that. And we can see that it's now added to the different workspaces that I can select from in the Workspace Picker. It's also very easy to return back to a specific workspace if, for example, I drag these two panels out. And by the way, you should know that if you drag a panel out and it's floating, you can actually drag that panel to a secondary monitor if you're working with more than one monitor. If I want to reset this, all I need to do is select the Workspace Picker and choose Reset JCost. If you ever want to delete a workspace, you can't delete the workspace that is active. So if I select delete right now, you'll notice that it won't allow me to delete the workspace that I just created. I'll click cancel, I'll choose any other workspace, and then I'll choose to delete my workspace that I just created. I'll click delete, yes, and then we can see that that JCost workspace is no longer available. And if I need to reset my essentials so that they're back to the beginning, I'll just choose Reset Essentials. One last shortcut that I just want to mention before we wrap up. When you have an iconic panel and you click on it so that it expands it, that panel will stay expanded even if you go and select a different tool. If you want that panel to automatically close when you select another tool, you can select your Preferences and then Workspace, and you can enable the Auto Collapse Iconic Panels. Now when I click OK and I select the History panel, and then I go and click on any other tool or do anything else in Photoshop, that History panel will auto collapse back to its iconic state. For now, I'll go ahead and reset that, choosing my Preferences again for Workspace, and then disabling it by unchecking it and clicking OK. So there you go. You can see how easy it is to switch between different workspaces as well as customize your own workspace and save it in Photoshop. In addition to using different panels, you will also spend a lot of time in Photoshop switching tools. Now, almost every tool has a shortcut. For example, the Move tool has the shortcut of the V key. The Marquee tool has the shortcut of the M key. So if I tap the M key, it switches me automatically to the Marquee, and if I tap the V key, it switches me back to the Move tool. If you don't know the keyboard shortcut for a tool, you can hover your cursor on top of it, and it will display it in the tooltip. If you don't want to see the tooltips, you can choose the Photoshop menu, and then Preferences, navigate to Tools, and then uncheck the Show Tooltips option. Some tools have a little triangle in the lower right-hand corner, and that tells you that there are nested tools underneath them. If you click and hold on that tool, the nested tools will fly out. So underneath the rectangular marquee tool, we also have an elliptical marquee tool. You'll notice it has the same keyboard shortcut as M. And we have the single row marquee tool and the single column marquee tool. Now these two tools do not have keyboard shortcuts assigned to them by default, and that's just because those tools aren't used very often. All right, I'll go ahead and select the rectangular marquee tool in order to keep that as my selected tool. If I wanted to select the lasso tool, I could tap the L key, but how do I select the other lasso tools that are nested within it without actually clicking and then choosing them from the flyout menu? Well, you just have to add the Shift key to the keyboard shortcut. So in this case, I would add Shift L, and you can see how it toggles me through all of the nested tools. If you would just prefer to tap the L key to cycle through all the tools without using the Shift key, you can return to the Photoshop Preferences and then select Tools and uncheck the option to use the Shift key for Tool Switch. For now, I'll go ahead and enable that and click OK. When we were arranging our workspace, I had mentioned that you could select the toolbar and actually dock it to the right-hand side to nest it with your panels on the right. But you should also know that you can float your toolbar and position it anywhere, including on a secondary monitor. For now, I'll go ahead and dock it back on the left-hand side. There is another behavior called spring-loaded cursors. For instance, if I have the Marquee tool selected, and I just tap the M key to select it, and then I want to temporarily swap to another tool, such as the lasso tool, I can hold down the shortcut for the other tool, not tap it, but hold it down. So for example, when I hold down the L key, you can see that I temporarily have access to the lasso tool. And when I release the L key, it brings me back to the Marquee tool. And you'll also notice that when you change tools, the options for those tools toggle in the options bar. That's a really great way of saving space because you'll only see the options for the tool that you have selected. Now, don't worry about learning the shortcuts to all of the tools right away. You'll learn the ones that you need, and soon enough, it'll be second nature to just tap the shortcut key to access the tool that you need. Keyboard shortcuts are a great way to increase your productivity, and as you become more comfortable in Photoshop, you'll learn the ones that you use all of the time. The shortcuts are listed next to the menu items, and we can see that many of the menu items do have keyboard shortcuts, but some of them do not. Just to decipher the keyboard shortcuts, this icon right here is the Command key or the Control key on Windows. The arrow is the Shift key, and this icon is the Option or the Alt key on Windows. But not every command, for example, the Auto Align Layers, has a keyboard shortcut, but we can change that using the Keyboard Shortcut Editor. I'll scroll down and select Keyboard Shortcuts. In fact, we could use a keyboard shortcut to access this. It would be Command Option Shift on Mac or Control Alt Shift on Windows. You can add shortcuts for your application menus, which are the menus across the top, for the panel menus, as well as for your tools. Let's begin with Tools. Now, you'll notice as I scroll down that almost all of the letters are already taken for the tools, but there are two that are not, and that is the K key and the N key. So let's scroll down, and two of the tools that I use quite often are the Brush tool and the Mixer Brush tool. But you'll notice that they all have the same keyboard shortcut, the B key. Well, I might not want to have to cycle through all of these, so there's two things I could do. I could either delete the shortcut from the tools that I use less often by clicking next to it and just selecting it and tapping the Delete key. So if I don't use the Pencil tool and I don't use the Color Replace tool very often, I can go ahead and delete those. But the Brush tool and the Mixer Brush tool still have the same keyboard shortcut. So if I tap the B, it's going to access the tool that I have selected, whether it's Brush or Mixer Brush. But then I would have to use Shift B to cycle through to the next one. Instead, I'm just going to change the Mixer Brush tool to have the keyboard shortcut of N. Now, if you wanted to select a different letter, for example, T, well, then Photoshop is going to give me a warning that the shortcut T is already in use and it will be removed from the type tools if I accept it here. And that's why I wanted to tell you that both the N key as well as the K key are not used anywhere else, so you don't have to remove them from any other tool. Let's scroll down almost all the way to the bottom here because there are some other additional features that aren't tools that we can assign keyboard shortcuts to. The foreground color picker and the background color picker, for example, I wouldn't necessarily consider them tools, even though they actually are in the toolbar. I'll go ahead and click to the right in this area here in order to add the custom keyboard shortcut K in order to bring up the foreground color picker. Now, we can also choose to create new shortcuts for our application menus. So let's choose the Edit menu. And then we'll scroll down until we see that option to auto align. As soon as I see auto align layers, there's no shortcut already assigned to it, so I'll click in the blank area to the right, and then I need to just type in the keyboard shortcut that I want. So in this case, let's try Command-Shift-D. Now, Command-Shift-D is already in use, but I don't use this menu command very often, this select and then reselect. So I'm willing to give up the keyboard shortcut from this command in order to apply it to auto align layers. I'll go ahead and click accept, and that has now reassigned it to this shortcut right here. Finally, you can also add custom keyboard shortcuts to your panel menus. And those are the menus that you see in the upper right of any of the panels that have drop-down menus here. So I could switch, for example, in my brushes panel, I could choose a custom keyboard shortcut to do something like copy the texture to the other tools. Or if I go down into my layers panel, I could assign a keyboard shortcut to automatically flatten my image. So here I'll enter in the keyboard shortcut, maybe Command F in order to flatten it, although that will remove it from the filter last filter if accepted, and I actually use this quite often, so maybe we'll try Command Shift and then F. And since I don't use the Edit Fade command very often, this would be a better keyboard shortcut for me personally, so I'll accept this. Now we can see that once we've modified the Photoshop defaults, it tells us that by adding this modified after the name. Now I would like to save this so that I can use this on my machine at home, and I would like to be able to synchronize these. So I'm going to click on the second icon here, and I will rename this JCost, and I'm going to save it in the default location right here in my keyboard shortcuts, and then click Save. When I click OK, let's go ahead and test some of those keyboard shortcuts. First, I will tap the N key, and we can see that my mixer brush was automatically selected. I can tap the K key, and that brings up the color picker. If I open up multiple images, I could test the Edit and then Auto Align Layers, but since I don't have a document open right now, you'll notice that that's grayed out. However, Photoshop did add the keyboard shortcut right here to the right, just in case I ever forget it and I need to reference it. If you ever want to reset the keyboard shortcuts, all you need to do is come back to the Edit menu, choose Keyboard Shortcuts, and then for Set, I will switch this back to the Photoshop defaults for now, and click OK. So creating custom keyboard shortcuts might seem like sort of a minor thing when you're first starting to learn Photoshop, but as you become more advanced, you're really going to want to access your tools and your menu items more quickly, and customizing your shortcuts is one of the most productive ways that you can do this. The Synchronize Settings feature in Photoshop CC uses your Adobe ID or your Adobe profile to synchronize your settings between multiple software installs, the 2 software installs allowed by the license agreement. So for example, if you have an install of Photoshop at home and you have one on your work computer. Now, you must have internet access and be signed into your Adobe account in order to synchronize the settings. If you're not, you would go underneath the Help menu, and then right here it would say Sign In, and you would need to sign in to your Adobe profile. As soon as you've signed in, you would select Photoshop, and then Preferences, and then choose Sync Settings. There are a number of different settings that you can synchronize. By default, it's synchronizing everything, but you can customize this and then check on or check off any of these different options. So for example, we can synchronize our preferences between our 2 installs. We can synchronize Workspace, Actions, and everything else that's listed right here. So for now, I want to synchronize everything, so I'll select that. So how you synchronize? Well, you'll want to choose which of your installs is on the master computer or which install you've made your changes to, whether you've saved out new brushes or swatches or any of these different things that you can synchronize. So let's say that we've made changes to this computer and I want to then upload them to Creative Cloud. So I'll click Upload and it will log on to the internet and upload these files to Creative Cloud. Now, when I get home tonight, I would launch Photoshop on my computer at home. I would come into these same preferences, but I would want to click Download in order to download all of those settings that are in the cloud. Now, one thing to know is that there is no conflict resolution, so it's not like Photoshop's looking for the most recent file. You need to always be in control of when you sync your settings and which machine you choose to upload and download from. And one caveat that I do want to mention is that workspaces that are created or uploaded from a different platform, like let's say, for example, you have one install on Mac and the other on Windows, those will not be downloaded. So it's this workspace area here that is the only exception for cross-platform. Okay, before we wrap up, I just want to mention, even if you only have one computer, like a single machine with a single install, I would still suggest that you take the time to synchronize your settings to your Creative Cloud account as you start really customizing Photoshop. It can save a lot of time to have all of your settings backed up in the cloud if you upgrade your machine or when something bad happens, like a drive goes down that has all of your settings and your applications on it. If you've synchronized those settings, you can get a new computer or a new drive, and when you install Photoshop, you would simply return back to the sync settings, and then you would download them from the cloud.